I've carried one sentence around for most of my life. Identity substitution is living someone else's life under your own name. That probably sounds backwards, but it made perfect sense to me when I was 28. My name is William. At least, that's the name on my birth certificate. It's the name my mother used when she was angry, the name printed on debt notices, eviction warnings, and the final letter from the bank that told me they were taking what little I had left. 3 months before this happened, I lost my job at a shipping warehouse outside town. Nothing dramatic, just budget cuts and a manager who shook my hand like he was doing me a favor. I had rent overdue, a car that barely started, and exactly $43 in my account. Every morning I would sit in my apartment and listen to the pipes knocking in the walls, trying not to think about how quickly a person can disappear while still being alive. That was when I met Daniel Mercer. He wasn't a friend. More like an accidental witness to my collapse. We started talking at a neighborhood bar because he noticed I was reading classifieds instead of watching the game. He was easy to talk to in the way some strangers are, careless, open, convinced the world was built to catch him when he fell. He told me too much. He worked in insurance claims. Lived alone. Same age as me, give or take a year. No close family nearby. Traveled for work twice a month. He laughed when he said nobody would notice if he vanished for a week except his landlord. I remember smiling when he said that. And I remember feeling something ugly move inside me. At first it wasn't a plan. It was envy. Then curiosity. Then the kind of thought you should kill the second it appears. What would it feel like to step into a life that wasn't collapsing? That was the first crime, if I'm honest. Not what I did later. The first crime was sitting there, nodding along, while a part of me quietly began measuring the shape of another man's life. A week after meeting Daniel, I started timing my days around his without admitting it to myself. That's how it begins, nothing theatrical, just small acts you can still call coincidence. I knew which barstool he liked, how long he stayed after work, which nights he left early because he had flights in the morning. I learned he hated cooking and ate from the same deli 3 blocks from his apartment. The woman behind the counter knew his order before he spoke. That detail stayed with me. It meant routine. Routine is trust wearing comfortable clothes. I told myself I wasn't planning anything criminal. I was studying possibility. That sounds worse now. I had debt collectors calling twice a day. My landlord had stopped asking politely. Every knock at the door felt like judgment. Meanwhile, Daniel complained about delayed flights and office politics. I remember feeling angry at how lightly he carried a life I would have traded everything to have. That was when envy hardened into intention. I stopped wondering if. I started thinking about how. The first deliberate thing I did was follow him home. Even writing that makes me feel smaller. I stayed half a block behind, hands in my pockets, pretending I belonged on that street. Daniel rented a narrow brick apartment above a dry cleaner. 3rd floor. Corner unit. The front door stuck when he pushed it. I noticed everything because fear sharpens attention into something almost painful. For the next 10 days I built a map of his life. Tuesday laundry. Thursday late at the office. Flights every second Monday. He left lights on when he was tired. He kept spare keys in the side pocket of a black gym bag. I saw that by accident, or at least that's what I told myself. I bought a notebook and wrote details down like I was studying for an exam. Building code. Delivery names. The insurance company he worked for. His handwriting from a receipt he dropped outside the deli. By then I understood I had crossed the line. What frightened me most was how calm I felt. The plan stopped being abstract the night Daniel mentioned a 3-day conference in another city. He complained about airports, said he'd be gone from Monday morning until late Wednesday. He said it casually, while stirring melting ice in his glass. I barely heard the rest of what he said. My pulse had started hammering in my throat. That weekend I rehearsed everything. I walked past his building twice a day, counting how many people came and went. The old woman downstairs watered plants at 7. The dry cleaner closed at 6. Nobody seemed to know anyone beyond nodding in the hallway. That anonymity felt like permission. I bought cheap gloves, a plain baseball cap, and a second-hand messenger bag. Nothing dramatic, just things that would make me forgettable. I kept telling myself I wasn't going there to steal valuables. Money leaves fingerprints. My idea was simpler and somehow worse. I wanted pieces of him. Documents. Mail. Enough to understand how a man is assembled on paper. Monday morning I watched Daniel leave with a rolling suitcase and a coffee in his hand. He looked annoyed, ordinary, completely unaware that someone across the street had built an entire decision around that moment. I waited another hour because leaving too quickly felt reckless. Every minute stretched. My palms were wet even though it was cold. The building door opened when a tenant came out carrying laundry. I slipped inside before it shut. That tiny click behind me sounded louder than an alarm. The hallway smelled of detergent and old plaster. 3rd floor. My legs felt strangely heavy. At Daniel's door I stood there pretending to read my phone until I was sure nobody was climbing the stairs. Then I reached into the side pocket of the black gym bag I had seen through his half-open doorway days earlier. The key was there. That was the moment I could have stopped. Instead I turned it, heard the lock release, and stepped into another man's life. The first thing that hit me was how normal everything looked. I had expected some dramatic feeling, some unmistakable crossing into criminal territory. Instead there was a lamp by the couch, a half-read paperback on the table, dishes drying beside the sink. A life reduced to ordinary objects. That almost made me leave. I moved carefully, touching as little as possible. Desk first. A stack of unopened mail, insurance forms, utility bills. In the bedroom closet I found travel folders and a metal box. My hands were shaking badly enough that I had to stop twice just to breathe quietly. Inside the box were copies of tax papers, an old passport, a social security card, employee ID badges from previous jobs. Not cash. Not jewelry. Proof. Pieces of identity stored like spare parts. Then I heard footsteps in the hallway. They slowed near the door. My entire body locked. I stood frozen beside the desk, listening to someone pause outside. For 3 seconds I was certain my life had ended there. The footsteps stopped right outside Daniel's door. I could hear keys touching metal, then a woman's voice from farther down the hall calling someone's name. The person outside moved away. Just like that. 3 seconds of terror, then silence. My knees actually weakened. I had to grip the edge of the desk because my hands had gone numb. That should have been enough to send me running. Instead, panic made me faster. I slipped the passport copy, 2 utility statements, and an insurance folder into the messenger bag. I kept checking the room, trying to remember where everything had been. That became its own nightmare. Had the lamp been angled that way? Was the chair tucked in farther? Criminals in movies never show that part. The absurd fear of a coffee mug being half an inch wrong. On the kitchen counter I noticed a framed photograph. Daniel with a woman and a little girl, maybe 6 years old. He had told me nobody close would notice. That was the first lie I discovered. That photograph changed the air in the apartment. Until then I had been treating Daniel like a file cabinet with a pulse. Seeing that little girl made him real in a way paperwork never could. I stood there longer than I should have, staring at her missing front tooth, the way she leaned against him like she trusted the world because he was in it. I left too quickly after that. On the stairs I almost collided with the old woman from downstairs. She was carrying groceries and looked at me with that sharp, practiced suspicion older people develop. "You visiting Daniel?" she asked. My mouth answered before my brain caught up. I smiled and said, "Yeah, work stuff." She kept looking at me for a second too long. Then she nodded and moved past. I didn't breathe properly until I reached the street. Back in my apartment, I emptied the messenger bag onto the table. Papers everywhere. My hands were trembling, but underneath the fear was something worse: relief. I had done it. And nobody had stopped me. That night I spread everything across my kitchen table and studied it for hours. Utility bills, employee numbers, addresses, dates, signatures. It felt less like stealing and more like archaeology, brushing dirt away from the outline of another person's life. I copied names into my notebook, memorized his handwriting, even practiced the way he formed the letter M. That part embarrasses me now. It was obsessive, almost intimate. The trouble started the next afternoon. There was a knock at my door. Not the landlord. Not debt collectors. It was the old woman from Daniel's building. For a second I thought I was going to faint. She held a folded piece of mail in one hand. "You left this in the hallway yesterday," she said. It was one of Daniel's envelopes. I must have dropped it while stuffing papers into the bag. I heard myself thank her like this was normal. She didn't leave immediately. Her eyes stayed on me. "You don't work with Daniel," she said quietly. That was the first moment someone looked straight through me. I could feel blood pounding in my ears. For half a second I honestly considered slamming the door. Instead I forced a laugh that sounded unnatural even to me. I told her Daniel had asked me to collect some paperwork because he was out of town. I said it too quickly. People who tell the truth don't rush. She kept studying my face. "He never mentioned you," she said. That sentence hit harder than an accusation. It meant I existed nowhere in his life. I was an intruder trying to stand inside a story that had no place for me. I shrugged, repeated the work excuse, and thanked her again. Eventually she left, but not before giving me a look that felt like memory. I shut the door and stood there for a long time, unable to move. That night I barely slept. Every car outside sounded like police. Every footstep in the hallway felt deliberate. For the first time, the thrill had burned off. What was left underneath it was fear. Real fear. Daniel came back on Wednesday night. I knew because I saw him from my window, dragging his suitcase up the sidewalk. My stomach dropped so hard I thought I might be sick. Until then he had been an idea, a set of documents, a pattern of habits. Suddenly he was a man walking home to a place I had entered without permission. I told myself maybe he wouldn't notice. I hadn't taken much. I'd put things back carefully. That was the lie I held onto for almost 12 hours. The next morning I passed his building and saw him outside talking to the old woman. Neither of them looked relaxed. He kept rubbing the back of his neck. She pointed once toward the street. Then he saw me. Not recognition exactly. More the instinct people have when a face almost belongs somewhere. His eyes stayed on me half a second too long. I kept walking. My shirt was sticking to my back with sweat. Every nerve in me was screaming not to turn around, because turning around would mean I already knew why he was looking. That afternoon Daniel knocked on my door. Not police. Not security. Just Daniel. I saw him through the peephole, and for a second my body forgot how to move. He looked tired, confused more than angry. That somehow made it worse. Angry would have been easier to understand. When I opened the door, he asked if we had met at the bar a couple of weeks earlier. His voice was careful, polite. I said yes. He held up one of the utility statements. "This was under my desk," he said. "My neighbor says she saw you coming out of my building Monday." My throat went dry. I started talking before I had decided what the lie would be. I said I had gone there because he'd left his wallet at the bar. I said I didn't want to bother him while he was traveling. Even as I spoke, I could see him stop believing me. He didn't accuse me. He just asked one quiet question. "Why were you inside my apartment, William?" I wish I could tell you I had some clever answer. I didn't. I just stood there with my hand still on the door, feeling every excuse collapse before it reached my mouth. For a few seconds neither of us said anything. Then I heard myself tell the truth, or at least the part of it I could survive saying. I told him I was broke. That I'd lost my job. That debt had made my life feel smaller every week until I could barely breathe inside it. I said I only wanted paperwork. I don't even know why I admitted that. Maybe because once someone sees through you, lying becomes exhausting. Daniel looked at me the way people look at damage after a storm, trying to understand what exactly had happened. You wanted my paperwork? He said. For what? I couldn't answer. That silence said more than words would have. He looked past me into my apartment, at the papers still on the table. Then his face changed. Not anger. Recognition. Fear. That expression broke something in me. Until then I had been thinking about consequences mostly in terms of getting caught, police, charges, humiliation. Standing there, I understood something uglier. I had made another human being afraid inside his own life. Daniel stepped back from the doorway. Not dramatically. Just enough to create distance. He asked if I had copied anything, used any of it, opened accounts, contacted anyone. His voice had gone flat. I told him no. That part was true. Then I did the only honest thing I had done in weeks. I brought him inside, put the messenger bag on the table, and handed everything back. Papers, notes, copies, even the stupid notebook. My hands were shaking so hard I almost dropped it. He flipped through the pages in silence. I couldn't even look at him. Finally he said, I should call the police. I nodded because he was right. Instead he asked me one question I still hear sometimes at night. Were you trying to become me? I told him no at first. Reflex. Shame. But the honest answer arrived a second later. Not you, I said. Just someone who wasn't me. He stood there for a long time, then took the papers and left. He never called the police. I don't know whether that was mercy or disgust. Maybe both. I moved out 2 months later. New neighborhood, worse apartment, same name. For a while every knock on the door still made my chest tighten. I kept expecting delayed consequences. They never came. The punishment was quieter than that. What changed was how I saw myself. I used to think desperation had pushed me over some line. That's only half true. Desperation opens the door. You still have to decide to walk through it. That's what I learned. If you ever find yourself envying somebody's life so much that it starts feeling like escape, stop there. Don't study their habits. Don't build stories in your head. Hunger can make theft feel logical. But crossing that line leaves something behind, and it's usually you.